Hello, good morning, good evening, and this is the third tutorial for the second semester, and I'm going to talk to you about the collection published by Oxford University Press and called Very Short Introductions. Now, all the slides that I'm showing you in this video will be uploaded in the online course, which means that you can quietly have a second look at all of this without or alongside the video. So to begin with, here in the first slide, you have an overview of 3 books from the collection entitled Very Short Introductions, and they have been recently released, and I've borrowed this image from the official website of the Very Short Introductions collection. And you have the address here, which you can double click if you want to with the PDF file once you have watched this video. The very short introductions, in the very words of the publisher, of the creators and editors of this collection, is, I quote, "a series which offers concise and original introductions to a wide range of subjects, from Islam to sociology, politics to classics, and literary theory to history. Not simply a textbook of definitions, each volume provides trenchant and provocative, yet always balanced, discussions of the central issues in a given topic. Our expert authors combine facts, analysis, new ideas, and enthusiasm to make often challenging topics highly readable. Whatever the area of study, whatever the topic that fascinates the reader, the series as a handy and affordable guide that will likely prove indispensable." Now, if I want to quote more or insist more specifically on some of the aspects, what I need to tell you is that the books in the Very Short Introductions collection are all range from 120 to 200 pages. They are all syntheses, and this is what the text here insists on: trenchant discussions of the central issues in a given topic, combining facts, analysis, new ideas, whatever the area of study. Last not least, a handy and affordable guide, meaning that it's not very expensive. Most of the books in the collections are sold £8, but as you will see later, there is a whole batch of books from the Very Short Introductions at the university library, which means that you don't even have to pay for those. And again, I insist on handy, meaning that these are paperbacks, meaning that they are rather small, they can be brought alongside everywhere, they are not heavy, and they are very useful as a synthesis. Here are a few quotes by magazines and newspapers and bloggers giving their opinion about the Very Short Introductions. In the New Yorker magazine, "The Very Short Introductions range from word reading to wonderfully appealing. Much of the pleasure to be found in them is the bedrock one of good non-fiction facts." Donc en français, voilà, c'est ce qui est fondamental dans tout texte qui ne relève pas de la fiction, les faits. Et donc ici, la citation du New Yorker insiste sur l'importance, évidemment, des informations factuelles, denses, vérifiées, utilisables de cette collection. Another quote, the second one, by Mark Greener in the Fortean Times: "I have a pile of the short introduction and they are uniformly excellent, an ideal way to dip your toe in a topic, and being relatively cheap allow you to decide whether invest in more expensive tomes." And here is a very essential information in that quote, the fact that these introductions are actually introductions. They are not cheating with the title. The title of the collection is Very Short Introductions. The books are short. They can be scanned, perused, or read in just a few hours, in a couple of hours even, and they provide an introduction to a domain. Even if you don't need to go further than that, they will help you. If you want or you need to go further, then they give you hints as to what you should read. A quote by Girl Scientist in The Guardian: "I absolutely love the VSI series. It's just so well produced, excellent writing and interesting topics. Just a superb overall series to dive into." And finally, a quote by Claire Fox, director of the Institute of Ideas: "I love the very short introduction series, as should everyone who is interested in the history of ideas. They managed to straddle that difficult line between making the complex accessible without ever compromising on quality." Et donc ici, évidemment, ce que met en avant cette citation de Claire Fox, c'est quelque chose qui est essentiel pour vous dès votre première année. C'est la possibilité d'avoir accès en anglais à des informations et à des données qui sont à la fois extrêmement fiables, extrêmement rigoureuses et tout à fait accessibles. C'est à la fois accessible et de très bonne qualité. Et donc c'est évidemment essentiel. Je continue cette citation avec la dernière phrase. I quote further from this blurb by Claire Fox: "They are a must-go-to gateway for those of us keen to know more but needing a steer as where to start." Et bien entendu, je vous le signale au passage, mais vous l'avez déjà fait par vous-même, s'il y a la moindre phrase, la moindre question, le moindre problème de compréhension lié à du vocabulaire, ces tutoriels, ces cours sont aussi l'occasion, bien sûr, pour vous d'enrichir votre vocabulaire. Il y a peut-être des mots comme a straddle, a steer ou asset qui sont un peu compliqués pour vous dans cette citation. Eh bien, c'est l'occasion pour vous de vérifier ces mots et de mieux comprendre et d'essayer même de vous approprier ces expressions. Je ferme la parenthèse française. I move on then to the third slide to talk about the very short introduction collection at the University Library Seat Tanner, which has remained open all through the crisis, all through the academic year. As you know, you can make appointments, but you can work every day from Monday to Saturday at the University Library, so don't forget about that. You can either look for titles in the online catalog by searching very short introduction in the online catalog. I'm not showing you this now, but this is very easily done. And more pragmatically, if I really want to talk to you about the volumes themselves, all the volumes for this collection, along with other books of general interest and encyclopedic knowledge in English, can be found, read, or glanced at the library third floor. So if you go to the library Seat Tanner to the third floor, this is where you will find all the books available from this collection on the same shelf, and it is important to note that they can all be borrowed. The University Library in Tours has some 200 books from the very short introduction collection. And if you look at this online with the leafing through pattern, le feuilletage, you can have access to the whole shelf from your computer. And of course here it's a print screen, so I can't click on the arrows, but if I were showing you this with the online website for the University Library, we could click on the arrows and look at what comes next. Now I'm going to take an example of one book in the very short introduction collections, and this is Malcolm Gaskell's Witchcraft. This is the cover for this book. So as you can see on the cover, you have the name of the author, Malcolm Gaskell, the title, Witchcraft, the subtitle, which is the name of the collection, a very short introduction, and the publisher, Oxford, here meaning Oxford University Press, one of the most important academic publishers in the English-speaking world. This is one way in which you can quote it, malcolmgaskill.witchcraft in italics .oxford Oxford University Press, or OUP if you choose the acronym, 2010, because the book was published in 2010. And I remind you that this is always the way in which you must quote any book that you need to cite. Now, books of this kind, and by this I mean Witchcraft by Malcolm Gaskill or any other book from the very short introduction, Books of this kind must never be read straight away. They are reference books, which means that you can either read them from beginning to end or read them to pick up information in various ways. Thus, it is essential to know what paratextual elements can help you in your search or searches. Note that a paratext, because I have just mentioned paratextual elements and possibly this was a bit puzzling for you, a paratext is any element that can be found in a book or on a website and which is not the main text. The cover, the various images, the footnotes, the table of contents are all paratexts. So let's look at some of these paratextual elements, and I hope you've understood that what I am saying is that with books like witchcraft, reference books in general, les ouvrages de référence with reference books, you are not expected to, or you are not supposed to read them from page 1 to the last page. These are books that can be useful even if you don't read them completely. So how can you decide what bits you're going to read? This is what I want to explore now with the various paratexts. One essential paratextual element is the table of contents. It helps you navigate inside the book, but even more importantly, it is useful in order to identify the various aspects of the book. Suppose that you have borrowed Malcolm Gaskell's Witchcraft, or that you have bought it, or suppose that you are just browsing this online and you have found the table of contents to make up your mind whether this book is worth buying or borrowing or not. The first thing you need to have a look at is the table of contents, because witchcraft is a very wide topic. If you look at witchcraft, la sorcellerie, you don't really know what to expect, because witchcraft is very wide in its exceptions or allusions. Now, here is the table of contents as you can find it at the beginning of the book. And this is the tradition, the publishing tradition in English-speaking countries. The fact that you always find that at the beginning and not at the end, as is still often the case in France. Here you have the titles for the various chapters, enabling you, of course, to locate them with a page. Let's suppose that you're only interested in the links between witchcraft and fantasy. You will go straight away to page 95. Of course, I know that you are familiar with that. You haven't waited for me in your first year at the university to explain to you how you use a table of contents. The thing I wanted to insist on, though, is the fact that here the chapter headings, the titles of the various chapters, can be very useful to understand what some aspects that you may have not been aware about, what these aspects are. Fear, heresy, malice, truth, justice, rage, fantasy, and culture. And for instance, chapter 3 is entitled Malice, and you must be warned against the fact that malice is a faux ami or a lookalike. It doesn't mean malice in French. It should be translated as evil, as having evil elements, so that here fear and heresy can be translated into les craintes et l'hérésie, but malice should be translated with a much stronger French word like le mal, for instance. The second paratextual element I would like to insist on is the index. It is always found at the very end of a book. And for instance, if you do not trust the Wikipedia or other often very complex online sites to have some essential information about, let's say, the history of the Salem trials, you might want to read a few selected passages from this book instead. Je fais une parenthèse, peut-être que quand je vous parle des procès de Salem ou des sorcières de Salem, ça ne vous dit absolument rien, mais peut-être que ça dit quelque chose à certains ou certaines d'entre vous. Eh bien, dans ce cas, une manière de se renseigner en anglais ça peut être largement aussi rapide d'aller consulter un livre sur la sorcellerie, qui est un livre écrit par un grand historien, un spécialiste du sujet, parce que je ne l'ai pas dit, mais c'était dit dans la présentation générale de la collection. Les différents titres de la collection sont confiés à des très grands spécialistes du sujet. Et donc ici, Salem, si ça ne vous dit pas grand-chose, ou si ça vous dit juste quelque chose d'assez vague, et bien là, vous allez pouvoir, grâce à l'index, identifier éventuellement des passages du livre dans lesquels il est question de cet élément historique et culturel. I resume in English, or I start again in English, I switch back to English. Ah, une autre parenthèse, resume ne veut pas dire résumer, ça veut dire reprendre. Donc quand je dis I resume in English, ça veut dire je me remets à parler anglais. Okay, so concerning the index, I have given you a print screen from page 4, page 144, and in the alphabetical order, of course, you will find the various entries beginning with the letter S, and as you can see, you have Sabbats, Salem, Satan, Skepticism, Science, Scientific Revolution, Reginald Scott, Scotland, among other entries. Now, I was mainly interested in the Salem entry, and as you can see, there are a lot of page numbers. Please note that apparently there is a whole longer passage from page 89 to 94, which is devoted to Salem and the Salem trials. As I have noted below the print screen, the reader is mostly directed to pages 89 to 94. The index thus saves a lot of time. As you can see, Salem is only an example and only one of the entries in the index, so it's very important for any type of reference book that you use to look up the index. If there is no index, it might be a bad book, and this is also something I should tell you about. If there is no index, possibly this is a book that should not be trusted that much. So this is also a way in which you can distinguish or select what books you're going to use or not. No index, leave it alone, leave it aside, don't bother, unless you are really certain that this is an important book, unless of course the book has been recommended by one of your professors or lecturers. So since we've been directed to pages 89 to 94, let's have a look at some of the pages here. This is the beginning of the sub-chapter devoted to Salem on page 89. I read, Hans Sebald refers to Salem syndrome, the child's propensity to believe fantasies about the criminal guilt of adults leading to miscarriages of justice. But at the Salem trials in Massachusetts in 1692, the most famous witch panic, the quote, victims, unquote, were not adults, but the children bewitched by adults. Some had died. Samuel Gray testified that an apparition of a witch appeared in his house one night, causing his baby to scream. From that time his, quote, very lively, thriving child did pine away, unquote. Directing the ensuing drama, as in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, 1953, where the girls writhed in the courtroom tortured by demons sent by the defendants. Je m'arrête là pour la lecture de cet extrait, mais ça vous montre que dès le début, l'auteur du livre, l'auteur de cette introduction, Malcolm Gaskill, part vraiment des faits, les relie à des éléments culturels et va ensuite proposer la synthèse la plus brève et la plus utile possible sur ce qu'il faut savoir sur cet épisode très connu, il dit bien The Most Famous Witch Panic, des sorcières de Salem. Si vous n'en avez pas entendu parler, c'est pas grave, mais maintenant ça y est, c'est bon. Among other things that you can find in those pages 89 to 94, you have an illustration. Here an illustration of George Jacobs, accused of witchcraft by his own granddaughter at Salem. He was executed on August the 19th, 1692. So here you have an illustration, because as with a lot of books, you have elements that are given, non-textual elements that are given to help you understand or focus better on what is at stake. And of course, the information about this man having been executed is also a reminder that people died after witch trials or ensuing witch trials. I am still talking about the second paratextual element I wanted to talk to you about, the index. As you can see, the index has directed the reader, has directed us to an interesting excerpt from the book, one that we have spotted and that we might, how shall I put it, restrict ourselves to. In other words, if the only reason why I was picking up Malcolm Gaskell's Witchcraft was to have a few essential informations about the Salem trials, I might only read these 5 pages and then close the book and not open it again. The third paratextual element I would like to insist on or quote is, in the wake of what you are still seeing online, is the list of illustrations. In the very short introduction collection, the list of illustrations is always at the beginning, but this is not always the case with publishers from English-speaking countries. In some cases, you don't have a list of illustrations. The details are given with each image systematically. And as you can see here, you've got all the details. For instance, the second illustration is a mid-19th century interpretation of Macbeth meeting the witches. It can be found on page 11, and you've got all the credits saying that, of course, the publisher has paid a copyright to the Musée d'Orsay and the Bridgman Art Library. The fourth paratextual element is the references. This part, which is always at the end of the book, indicates the precise references of all the texts and authors quoted and cited in the various chapters. Here below, you'll find the various references corresponding to chapter 8, last chapter entitled Culture. So this is the list of references. And as you can see, this chapter discusses the material reconstructed by J.K. Rowling and in the various adaptations of her novels. So as you can see, chapter 8 has 3 sub-chapters: Reinventing Witches, Hogwarts and all, and the New Age. Et par parenthèse, parce que je suis toujours un petit peu surpris quand en 3e année, les étudiantes et les étudiants de LLCER anglais s'interrogent, parce que je les interroge, sur la traduction de Hogwarts par Poudlard, eh bien je vous invite à ne pas attendre la 3e année pour vous demander pourquoi ça se dit Poudlard et qu'est-ce que c'est censé vouloir dire et quel jeu de mots, parce que Hogwarts est un jeu de mots et Poudlard est censé être un jeu de mots. Bref, je referme la parenthèse puisqu'on parlait de Harry Potter. The fifth paratextual section is entitled Further Reading. In the volume by Malcolm Gaskill, this can be found from page 133 to 137, and this section is really for people who start specializing in a subject. For instance, if you are writing at some point, if you write in 3 or 4 years an MA dissertation, un mémoire de master, on one aspect of witchcraft in either history of culture, then you'll need to have a close look at that section, but you still have time. Don't bother for the time being. So this is what could be said about the various paratextual elements and how they can be used. Before you start reading a reference book, always have a look at the index, the table of contents, the further reading section, the list of illustrations. Even a quick glance will help you understand what the book is actually about and what use it can be to your own work. I will now have, together with you, a closer look at a few passages from this book. I have selected passages from chapters 1, 2, and 7. If I'm not mistaken, let me double check because I have suddenly a doubt. Yeah, it's, chapter 5, so excerpts from chapters 1, 2 and 5, and as I said at the very beginning of this tutorial, the PDF file that I am currently commenting can be found as a PDF file in the Selene course so that you can have a second glance at all of this, especially if it goes too fast. So this is an excerpt from chapter 1, the first chapter in the essay, in the reference book. And chapter 1 is entitled Fear. So it is about the general notion of how witches have been known to induce fear in societies. I quote, "The nuts and bolts of witchcraft therefore might be detected in the earliest civilization, the theism, animism, and conflict, as well as the legalism that defined cursing the better to prescribe and punish it. Things were not much different in Egypt. Rituals, spells, and taboos were endemic, and the open frontier between this world and the next elaborately constructed. Greece and Rome followed the Egyptian lead. For all its grandeur and glory, the classical world was steeped in the dark manipulation of spirits. Here was the means to alleviate anxiety, deploy anger, and satisfy desire. Nor was this residual or eccentric a precursor to the arts and sciences, later celebrated by an ascending West. Magic was part of an accepted and vibrant reality integral to everyone's culture and mentality. When tracing our social ancestry back to the ancients, we should take the rough with the smooth, that is, the superstitious with the rational. But how reliable are terms like superstitious and rational? This is a thorny problem. How to describe contemporary ideas faithfully using the idiom required by a modern audience? These two criteria are the emic and the etic, the internal meaning of things in the past and their representation in the present. Unconsciously, we draw lines between religion and magic, religion and science, science and superstition. But to our ancestors, distinctions were less stark. Je ne vais pas lire la totalité des 3 pages que j'ai incluses dans ce document. Je vous laisserai le soin de les consulter. Ça se trouve de la page 13 à la page 15 du document PDF. Pour l'instant, je vais juste m'arrêter sur ce passage que je viens de lire et vous dire en français, parce que je pense que là, vous allez peut-être un petit peu fatigué, que ce passage du livre de Malcolm Gaskill nous invite en fait à penser d'autres concepts. Et ici, typiquement, dans cette phrase-là, "These two criteria are the emic and the etic, the internal meaning of things in the past and their representation in the present." Pour vous dire la vérité, avant de lire ce livre de Malcolm Gaskill, ces deux concepts, je ne les avais jamais rencontrés. Ça veut donc dire que si vous ne voyez pas de quoi il s'agit, c'est tout à fait normal, ce n'est pas des concepts extrêmement fréquents. Mais ce qui est intéressant, c'est la manière dont Gaskill recontextualise dans le premier chapitre. C'est évidemment le premier chapitre, ça compte, c'est une manière aussi de déjouer un certain nombre de problèmes de terminologie, c'est-à-dire que en fait, ce qu'il cherche à dire, c'est que d'emblée, la question de la sorcellerie, ou de notre perception contemporaine de la sorcellerie, elle s'appuie sur une vision souvent très dualiste, draw lines between religion and magic, religion and science, science and superstition, mais qu'en fait, ce dualisme n'était pas aussi évident il y a encore quelques siècles, d'où le émic et le éthique, l'émique et l'éthique, sans H. Le fait qu'il s'agit de la représentation substantielle et de la représentation que l'on se fait actuellement. Donc le regard rétrospectif et le risque aussi, bien sûr, d'anachronisme. Donc ça, c'est évidemment essentiel. Mais c'est pour vous montrer comment ces essais, ces livres de référence, ils vous permettent de penser la terminologie, de penser les concepts, ils permettent aussi de les relier à d'autres concepts. Donc c'est aussi une remarque importante à faire. I switch to the excerpt from chapter 2. And chapter 2 is about heresy, as you remember. And this is to show you what Malcolm Gaskill does in this book, which you could call historiography. Historiography has to do with the way in which a historian, here Malcolm Gaskill, revisits and deconstructs previous historians, which means that here, this very short introduction on witchcraft is not just a historical essay on what witchcraft has been, but also an introduction to what previous historians said and how possibly some of them were wrong or biased, so that Malcolm Gaskill is trying to reassess the notion of witchcraft itself. Here in this passage, which I will let you read at home with the PDF file once again, in this passage, the reassessment concerns one Margaret Murray, a mythologist from the 1920s, Margaret Murray, and what Malcolm Gaskill says about Margaret Murray's work and how Margaret Murray's work was integrated into historical writings about witchcraft is very interesting. So I will let you read that on your own. And the fact that Margaret Murray's work was ignored or criticized by historians, but more or less ignored, resulting, of course, in a huge frenzy for ideas, romantic and popular take on medieval and early modern witches, I quote here. Okay, so this is about historiography. So the reason why I have included this excerpt from chapter 2 is to show you how these books, these reference books, include also comments about what other historians have done and try to provide a kind of synthesis about what can be kept and what should be left aside from previous historians. Last excerpt I have given is an excerpt from chapter 7, and this is where I made a mistake. In fact, it's chapter 5, chapter 5, Justice. And in chapter 5, which I have incorrectly quoted as chapter 7, this is a mistake here, so it's chapter 5. In chapter 5, entitled Justice, Malcolm Gaskill treats or questions a different aspect, which is, among other things, if it can be said that people tried and accused of witchcraft and quite often condemned to death because of witchcraft, if these people can be considered as victims or not, and of course, essentially, how many people died. I will let you double check what kind of figures Gaskill gives, but here what is interesting, of course, is the very historic take on this. And as you can see, it begins with a general consideration about why it is important to know how many people died, where, how, and what kind of conclusion can be drawn from that. But it then moves on to what had really happened. And I will let you look at that, of course. Let's look in more detail at what had really happened. And I have here included 3 pages, an excerpt which goes from page 69 to page 71 from Malcolm Gaskill's Witchcraft, published by Oxford University Press in 2010. And these 3 pages can be found in my PDF file from page 18 to page 20. And as you can see, he mentions several historical figures, some of whom you are familiar with, like, of course, Joan of Arc, the mystical warrior Joan of Arc, burned for heresy and treason, but with supplementary charges of invoking spirits. So here you've got a kind of historical overview trying to sort out what happened at what period and to see how several different cases can be differentiated or distinguished. Okay, I'm not going to talk more at length about the very short introduction collection or about Malcolm Gaskill's Witchcraft, which I took as a kind of example of books from this collection. So this tutorial is now over. It is, I guess, something like 30 or 35 minutes long. So don't hesitate to play it again, to watch it again. Don't hesitate, of course, to open the PDF file and have a second look at the various points I underlined or commented on. But more importantly than anything, never forget, if there is anything interesting you want or need to take in that kind of reference book, as with any book, you need to quote and cite. Please have a look again at the course on how to avoid plagiarism if this is still not completely clear. And you must be reminded that the course and the tutorials about how to avoid plagiarism were given during the first semester, and the tutorial is still available in the YouTube channel, so you won't have trouble finding it. When I say in that kind of reference book, if you pick up anything you need to quote and cite, I hope that you are familiar with the difference between quote and cite, because in French it might look like it's the same word, it isn't. Quote corresponds to the French citer, and cite corresponds to the French donner les références. So you need to quote and cite. Have a nice day.